and fellow bibliophiles, thank you for joining us for another episode of Page Turners Plus. Today is a very special day. Deborah, whom you've seen from time to time, is joining us as a regular panelist. So, welcome, Deborah.
Hi, happy to join you all today.
Now, uncharacteristically, we'll be discussing a YA novel today. Sweetness in the Skin sparked a rare bidding war with seven publishing houses vying for publication rights. It's the first novel of Jamaican writer Ishi Robinson. Pumkin, the protagonist, is 11 years old when we first meet her. Born southwest of the halfway tree clock, she has no postcode privilege. She also has not won the parental jackpot. Her mother, Paulette, on the rare occasions when she is present, is neglectful at best and abusive at worst. She doesn't meet her father, Akil, until her teen years, and he's even less wholesome than Paulette. Pumpkin's salvation resides in her aunt Sophie and her grandma Cecile, who love her, and the social currency of her light skinned and prestige school education. When Aunt Sophie leaves for France and Grandma Cecile dies, Pumpkin's prospects plunge even farther south than her postcode. I'm so glad Kesawa is here today um, because a member of this panel, who shall remain nameless, once used the word Jamaican, the phrase Jamaican apartheid. Is this what we witness in this story? I think Kesawa might be a good person to start to answer this question.
I mean, I've certainly never coined the term, though I may have used it, having heard it from Jamaican friends who had used it describing social interactions that they had at home. And I think they were describing why they couldn't go to a particular coffee shop or meet particular family members or something. I can't remember the details, but the phrase stuck with me, so I'm not surprised that if it came out again, it stuck with others. Do we? Is that what we're witnessing? I think so. It's really about the kind of the strictures of Jamaican social society and the strict kind of stratification of it. But it's probably worth mentioning that this book is not set in the present, huh? It's set sort of 30 years ago in like the mid 90s. And it also starts much earlier because we meet the grandmother, or the main character's grandmother, in her own youth. So that's sort of the early 1960s. And I was really curious about this, if anyone else had thoughts on this, because I was trying to figure out kind of that we only get the protagonist, the main character, Pumpkin's date of birth once. Like, she's born in 1981, and we know she's born to a teen mother, so she's born. Own mother's probably born in the 1960s. But is she a post or pre-independence baby? Right? Does that moment completely not make no difference to their lives, or does that shift like the power dynamics, and that's why she's able to kind of have the relationship that she has with her employer after the baby is born, etc., without giving too much away? That is what I think is happening. I think there's different points where we're thinking about the way that social stratification in Jamaica works, but I'm not an expert on it, Paula. So I think I would say it's definitely a real insight if people are totally unfamiliar with the kind of strict class and color divisions that are all over the Caribbean, but I think are particularly, from my experience, particularly kind of impermeable, perhaps is the word, and the lengths that people go to make them more permeable.
I think Grandma Cecile is a pre independence baby. Everybody else, I suspect, was born after independence. Just from my reading of the of the timelines. For example, I was born 2 years after independence. Um, so I that is how I read it. Um, did you think that there was any special value in this story being told, this story which deals with class and color in Jamaica, being told from the perspective of an adolescent?
Um, I think the value in that, Paula, is it shows how when your mind is young, you certain things that you're not really processing, and as you get older, you learn these codes about social stratification and all that. So I see the value there. I see, how Pumpkin was going through her thought processes, and the way her aunt wanted her to be and questioning why and those sorts of things because she's not yet coded, with the um, social stratification code. That's what I saw as being told from the perspective of somebody, an adolescent.
Yeah, I just want to add to this question of perspective, to echo what Tony was saying. It does amplify a lot of the amplify the more scary or traumatic parts of Pumpkin's experience, and it calls to mind a storytelling tactic that maybe somebody like Olive Senior would have used in her collection, for instance, the Summer Lightning, and even the two grandmothers, and also in her poetry, for example, Colonial Girls' School. I kept thinking, I have them here in my notes as I have a lot of notes on this story, that it recalls those stories, the two grandmothers, Bright Thursday, even Do Angels Wear Braziers, where the child's perspective is amplified and shows this stark contrast between how a child would see the world and how an adult would see the world. And speaking of trauma, the opening dramatic scene, I think everybody knows what I'm speaking about with the iron. That was perfectly illustrating how children disassociate and how they like we saw what happened to her in real time, but she was not completely understanding what happened to her, considering what she does after she's attacked, I would say, with this iron. So I think the child's perspective works, and it caused me to wanted to give her a hug and to see how I could get her out of that situation, because poor little Miss Pumpkin, she went through a lot. She was going through it.
Yeah, it recalled. I'm not as familiar with Olive Senior's work. I know of Olive Senior, but not the work that you mentioned, Deborah. But it got me thinking about some other books that we've read as well, about parents and children, particularly the Dominican story. It's just Clap When You Land, which is also kind of a child's take on what was going on, a complex kind of relationship between sisters with the same father. And also, I think some of Mel Collins' most magnificent writing actually is Rain Darling, right? Which is all about a kind of parent-child relationship. And this story, in lots of ways, is quite different for those, actually, I think, because these similar paths to Clap When You Land, but I think what's really special actually about this novel is that it manages to raise some really serious issues, and realities that some young people face. And there are children that have parents like the parents that we see here. And I think she's quite lucky in some respects, because she does have another family member who kind of offers protection from the terrible situation she's in. And that isn't always the case, right? That's how people end up in care, because they don't have that family member who can take the place of the biological parent that's capable or unwilling to care for them. Um, but it also is really, I think, really clever actually, in that it offers, because it's got this looming outside is escape kind of sub kind of plot going on. And I think it's quite clever at pointing out that Jamaica isn't the problem. She's just in an abusive family. And that's a really tight line, I think, to cross, right? That she on the one hand, you've got this really difficult family situation, which is attributed at one point. I think Miss King's talking about poverty and how mothers in this context can be really difficult for like reasons that are kind of logical, but it doesn't make it. But it's not all of them, and she's really careful to make those kind of points, whilst at the same time having this escape is abroad, but also kind of then. I mean, I think the novel's doing a lot. Huh? I think the novel's really kind of doing a lot in terms of balancing these different tensions, these different realities and difficulties and possibilities for hope. I think it's a really, yeah, and to do it all through the eyes of a child, there's a simplicity that makes those choices clear, right? And also because the thing about the child is she's often the last to be consulted on the decisions that affect her life. She's not an adult in charge and responsible for the choices that are made. She's dealing with a hand that's been dealt to her, of which she has so little control. And that's what I think brings the drama as well, because then it's heartbreaking, right?
There was something scary about that the way that Pumpkin's story unfolded to me, because I was looking at the reality here on the ground in St. Vincent. Let me just speak in the St. Vincent context and coming to the understanding that Pumpkin is not alone in this narrative. I mean, this is something that's around, and that scares me. That because it exposed it, something that I know, but maybe I walk around with a shield, thinking or pretending it's not there, but it's very much there, and it's it's scary to me that the children being raised with that reality, and you know, it's all about a lifetime of trying to escape. And sometimes I wonder if that reality doesn't make the whole thing cyclical. Does it repeat itself because of what becomes eh, the norm, right? So
But
I just found all that scary. Yeah.
the novel goes there, though. The novel shows us Paulette's relationship with Brahma Cecile, and I think the novel is does that to explain to us why Paulette became the kind of mother she did. It was because she was neglected by Grandma Cecile. She wasn't loved well by Grandma Cecile. So that's her. Part of it is revenge, I think, and part of it is she didn't have the best examples of parenting. Um, the revenge part, I think, is because Pumpkin, like Sophie, is light skinned, and Grandma Cecile and Sophie pour a lot of attention on Pumpkin. So the same kind of resentment that she has for Sophie, she transfers to Pumpkin. But Deborah said something earlier. She said, you said, not sorry, not Deborah, sorry, Kesua earlier said that in some ways Pumpkin is lucky because she has Sophie who loves her so much. What do you make of Sophie? Is 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 she is Pumpkin really so lucky?
Yeah, good question. I think Sophie is the result of the way she was raised, right? By Grandma Cecile, who was, as you just said, poured everything into her because, she was this lovely, light-skinned baby with good hair, and so she could go places. But yeah, I agree with you, Paul. I think, yes, Pumpkin was lucky in some ways to have someone in the family who was rooting for her, given the way her mother treated her. But I'm not sure if Sophie was necessarily the best person to have in her corner. I think she ended up having other people who were rooting for her who were much better positioned. Boots and Miss Keen. I think she was more lucky to have them. Her friend Tamara, even though that didn't always was it wasn't 100%, and Miss Lynette from the shop as well was also someone who, though she was definitely lucky to have them, I would say more so than Sophie.
No, I don't know if more so than Sophie because Sophie did love her. And
Yes.
Sophie did give her stability and everything she needed. Sophie just stepped into the motherhood shoes.
Hmm.
But it's a good thing that she had those other
Other
people
people.
Yeah,
Hmm.
for some
to
balance.
balance off
Mhm.
where Sophie
Yes,
was going
because
wrong.
Sophie definitely had serious class related colorism
Social
issues.
climbing,
Social,
it's
yeah.
called,
So
but
she
social
she
climbing,
saw one
Francine, go
one
ahead.
way. For her there was only one way to improve their lot, right? For her, she didn't see any other way. She just saw this one way, and even when she got to that, got to where she wanted to be, she still wasn't 100% satisfied. She was still trying to climb, climb, climb.
Yeah, social climbing in the Caribbean is the benchmark is to be like our colonizers
Hmm.
were, and that basically is the benchmark. So we're trying to get there. We're trying to be more British than the British, or more French than the French. and that's you. So you saw that with Sophie.
Hmm.
Um, but I agree with Paula. You know, Sophie was still a positive influence in at the end of it. Still a positive influence in um, Pumpkin's life, and she did love her. And I agree that the other more balanced characters were necessary to give Sophie that. Sorry, Pumpkin, that sort of balance. But then Pumpkin herself, though, reflects sometimes on Sophie's rationale for things and so on. So I thought Pumpkin was also figuring it out, you
Yes,
know.
because she really didn't understand, what happened with Boots, right? With so yeah, she really struggled with that. She was like, I don't understand, like why he's so good. He's so good to her. He obviously cares, why is she making this choice? She really struggled with that.
I just also wanted to add that she had a moment of clarity where where she by she I mean Pumpkin, where she saw that some of the same prejudices that created the barrier between Sophie and Boots were what she was sort of leaning into when she was critiquing the French teacher's accent and the way she pronounced the French words with her accent. So I found that I really appreciated that moment of growth for Pumpkin. Even though I was like, little girl, what are you doing? When she was coming after let me rephrase that. When she was critiquing the French teacher's enunciation.
In many ways, Pumpkin was a little rank picnic, though, you know. She was very aware of her privilege. She was very aware because Sophie taught her, and well, the whole society taught her. Grandma taught her, Sophie taught her, the whole society taught her.
School taught her as well. Let's not forget school.
School taught her that the fact that she was light skinned, she had long hair, she could
And
speak
the Queen's
the
English.
Queen's English made her better than Miss Simmet, who couldn't pronounce her own name. And quite frankly, I don't think it's just Jamaica. I know I grew up with all those prejudices, and I mean, I am not as light as, say, Pumpkin was, but I am light skinned and I grew up with light skin privilege. So I
I don't
know
think
that.
it's just
I
Jamaica,
know
Paula.
I know how it works. I know it's not just Jamaica, but
Yeah,
in Jamaica,
yeah.
but classism in Jamaica is a lot
More
deep,
acute.
runs a lot deeper than it does
Mm,
on St. Vincent, for example.
yeah.
I think of the societies that I know well in the Caribbean, I think classism runs deepest in probably Jamaica and Trinidad. Of the two of the islands I know, of the territories I know.
For me, I think Jamaica reminds me a lot of Martinique, more so than much, and very different to Guadeloupe in that sense as well. That kind of real obsession with light skin privilege and the real kind of everydayness of it. Actually, like the fact that like, of course, this is the more attractive of the two sisters because this one's light and this one's dark. Of course, this is the smarter child in the class because she's lighter and she therefore gets better marks, even though the actual capacity of the two children is the same. Or in fact, she's the weaker student. Like these kind of things. This is what I saw in
Let me
Martinique.
stop you there, though, Kesawa, because I never saw that. I never saw
Ooh.
any assumption of intelligence based with
Oh no,
lightness.
Martinique is the assumption
Never,
of
never
intelligence.
ever saw that.
No,
Never.
that's too dark to understand. A thing is a real thing in Martinique.
No, I never. So maybe on Martinique it's worse.
So maybe Martinique is top of the ranks.
Yeah,
But
but
that
I never ever saw any
You know, I've never
association
seen
with
that in St.
color
Vincent
and
at all.
intelligence in Jamaica. Never.
so I hope I'm not going to speak out of place and tell a story that like is a family story. But there's okay, so I'm gonna avoid names to avoid that. But there's a very famous musician from Martinique who went to a very good school when she was a child in the 1960s. And she I think I don't think I heard it from the musician that I happen to know, so I think it must be like a well-known thing, but she famously like was marked down at school because she was darker than the lighter skinned kids. like even though she was performing better. And that was some, and I worked in education and marketing. That was my job. And so I heard terrible stories. I saw it in my own eyes, like preference being given to lighter students, and the assumption of intelligence for lighter students. And sometimes it's not, people aren't stupid. It's not necessarily an assumption of intelligence. It's the same thing I saw you see in England as well, where teachers know whose parents are going to come in and complain and whose parents are not. And so that's the assumption a lot of the time as well. It's not just that the child is more intelligent or less intelligent. It's that this is the child who I can get away with treating badly. And that's also an assumption that can be a mistake as well, right? That, it's all assumptions, but no, it definitely plays out in education. It definitely plays out. It's wild. It's wild. All my information about Martinique is at least 7 years old. So, take it with a pinch of salt because I left there in 2019, 18. But
But
yeah,
how do you feel, though, about the fact that this story, which confronts colorism, is told from the perspective of someone who benefits from the legacy of colorism? No one thought that was problematic? That's interesting.
No,
Okay.
I didn't
Mm, no, I
think. I mean, I'm trying to think on my feet now, but not. It wasn't something that hit me straight off. That it was problematic.
I'd I'd go so far as to say sometimes it's like when white people blow the whistle on racism. Like they know it better than the rest of us. They know the detail of what their colleagues and friends are doing. Like sometimes it's actually a stronger account in some ways because like when we say it, we're just bitter and complaining like they did
Mm,
this thing or
mm,
they did that thing and it was because we were
mm,
black. But the
yeah,
white people, no, that's
and
not exactly what happened.
as I think Tony mentioned that we saw Pumpkin's growth throughout it, and I mean I think that is a positive perspective to have, right? She understood that she benefited from colorism. I think she did understand that towards the end of the book. So I
But
mean,
there was that dynamic between her and her friend, the friend who came over to spend the
Right.
night.
to spend the
I was
night.
about
That
to
was
say
yeah.
there's this intersection of, well, our complex layering of this, the question of color versus
Class.
class.
Hmm.
Because when, yes, she has the color privilege, the pretty girl privilege, right? But there's a class distinction, so much so that, was it Maddie her name was?
Mandy.
Glenn?
Mandy.
Mandy,
Mandy. Mm.
who visited her and then visited her house. That scene was so uncomfortable for many reasons. And then there was this rumor afterwards that Pumpkin's house was dirty, and you can't buy food from her, buy her pastries or anything like that. So the color privilege is there, but there's also a question of class, and all of it is wrapped up in a nice post-colonial ribbon that I feel like the novel is making a larger statement on. That, I mean, I might be veering off topic a bit, but I wonder what it means to have a focus on this, on that topic at this time. Um, but that's
But no
that.
time like the present, Deborah,
No, but
because I,
but
No,
I,
no,
I
I
want to
mean,
hear.
I feel
yeah,
like I'm
No,
at
no,
this
I
time
want
of,
to hear what Deborah mean.
yeah.
What do you mean by that? What does it mean
I
to have a focus of it on it at this time? Because I'll tell you why I'm asking the question. Because
mm,
it's a current situation. It's a current
I
problem.
oh I
The
agree with I
colorism, the
agree I agree
classism
with
is a
that.
current problem.
Uh-huh. But I guess how I'm processing it in my head is that I've read these stories. I feel like I've been reading these stories, and it's not an indictment. It's not any sort of negative towards the novel, but it felt so familiar that I had to really ask myself if nothing has changed at all, or if because it felt like I was reading the classic West Indian literary classics. Like I was going through a West Indian literary classic course.
I know
The
that feeling. It
color
feels
and
as if you're
class.
getting nowhere. It's like Okay, it's a
Not to say that
familiar
not to say
story.
that these problems don't persist,
They
but
persist.
it just felt sort of very familiar. And but I was speaking about the class question. Pumpkin has color privilege, but I wonder, but to sort of bring it into perspective as well, who eventually gets her free? What power, what authority is appealed, is deployed? What card is deployed to help free her from her mom in the end?
I can answer that one because I think that's why I was really emotional reading the novel. I don't think there is a single answer, right? I think it's very much a community effort, right? Her mum is actively trying to prevent her from reaching her own personal goals that she's worked really hard for. And I hope we are all sitting there cheering her on, going, "Come on, bake some more, sell some more. You'll do it. You can make it." And then, like, her mum's wickedness knows no bounds, essentially, and it's trying to indict her into modern slavery, from what we can tell. Um, and she confidently tells her mother, "People will look for me." And that's, I think, a big important moment of growth when she realizes she isn't alone, actually. Auntie Sophie's in France, but she is here and she has people that care about her. And it wasn't from the adult perspective, like, well, the school obviously know that she hasn't turned up to school and there's no explanation, so they'll call, right? In the way that I think is kind of your safeguarding kind of reflex. She knows that someone's going to look for her, and she's right. The very same day, people come start asking questions, and there is a whole host of people. When she recounts it, I can't believe I was so emotional. I was like, the two friends that are warring for like the whole book suddenly come together for the greater good of saving Pumpkin. Like the aunt's ex-boyfriend who has no real skin in the game and is just a caring black man, which I think we need to talk about because he's a beautiful character, Boots, and he's such a nice, what's the word I'm looking for, counterpoint to her own actual father, who is also present in the story and is nothing but a force of negative wickedness, from what I could tell. And and I think yeah, I think that's kind of the point, right? That she's not saved by any single person. She's saved primarily in lots of ways by herself, right? By the fact that other people are impressed by her own efforts, they're inspired to help her. Like, and I think that's a real kind of testament as well to, like, I just think that's a beautiful piece of storytelling. I'm very, very far off your question, Deborah. I apologize. But I think if there isn't one person, there's a bunch of people. And she's actually ultimately the kind of person that brings it all together. Other people make efforts and do things, but she's the one that pulls it out of the bag. And I think that's really special. I said that word twice today. Sorry, everyone.
How concerned is this novel with the parent child dynamic as opposed to the color class dynamic? Do you think one is more important to this story?
Well, I saw both
Which
things
one?
going on. I saw that parent-child relationship as definitely a strong theme throughout the novel, and I also saw it sort of interwoven with, not sort of, very much interwoven with the question of class. They were both running parallel and both equally important. That's basically how I saw that. There was something that Keswa said. I hope I'm not taking us too far back, but something that Keswa said about the was it Boots, the father, sort of father figure in the end. I don't know if you could describe him as that, but speaking from the perspective of a man, there are men in the Caribbean who play that role, and they are not celebrated enough. Um, you know, they are they step in where biological fathers fail, and for matter of fact, they're saviors. I think in a lot of times, and so Boots was definitely an exemplar in that sense.
We saw that kind of character in the last novel we read in Kipling class. Um, the same sort of character who steps in as a surrogate father for the boys. And Boots, yes, Boots does play. But those of us who've read Kipling plus, did you see any similarities? How do you think this novel compares with Kipling plus, in as much as it's telling the story of an adolescent? Did you see any similarities? Did you?
They're both from the perspective of from adolescence. So I saw one's a boy, one's a male, one's a female, boy, girl. Um, two differently pitched stories, I feel, because I didn't see Kipling Glass so much. It's hard to write a Caribbean novel without bringing in class. Anyway, let me just say that up front, right?
Yes.
But this Sweetness in the Skin was class focused. There's no two ways about it. Kipling Glass was about Kipling Plas himself trying to find his way, actualize the camaraderie with his group. Um, eh, you don't like me to use the word dysfunctional, Paula, but in Kipling Plas, the stars a lot of those characters were dysfunctional characters, you know. In this one, um, I saw more of a normal society, but with its complications, right? That's how I saw that.
Well, Kip in everybody in Kipling class belonged to the same social class. It was a working
Right.
class community, so you wouldn't have those dynamics in that novel.
Can I just, sorry to take us back a little bit, but can I disagree with Tony's earlier statement about class and the parent being kind of on equal footings as dynamics? I thought class was secondary to the parent child dynamic in the novel. I thought
Mhm.
parent child dynamic was kind of the center of the novel, and class colorism play into that dynamic, but it was the story was about the child and her parent. Like that was the heart of the story and everything. And she was living at these kind of, and in some ways, I guess the novel's using that child's own social position, education levels, situations to tell some stories about class and color. But I didn't think they were the driving force of the novel in some ways. They're very important to how the novel and the characters interact and how the novel plays out. But it wasn't the center for me. That I mean, maybe that's just a perspective thing, right? I'm
I
not
think
sure
it's
that's
a
right.
perspective because I couldn't do the unraveling that you did. I just felt that they were throughout sort of really threads of the same rope. That's how I felt.
Yeah, I
Well,
agree
I
with
this
Tony. For me, I felt they were about the same. The two themes I found were running parallel and were pretty much equal in terms of how the story was approached. I wouldn't say that one was stronger than the other.
There is a sense of generational trauma, and how different. So I see how, for instance, grandmother conceived these two girls, and then there's the transfer of abuse, mistreatment of one. Then that child now turns around and she becomes a mother herself, and then she transfers all of her rage at being mistreated and abused and neglected onto her child. And that child then has to parent herself and navigate. And Pumpkin, at coming to the end especially, was parenting herself after her grandmother passes, and her aunt Sophie becomes like a barrel parent, um, you know. So it's parenting is there throughout, but then it sort of ties into what we were talking about earlier, where other people stepped in to provide her with some kind of parentage too, communal, community informed, community coming together to act as parental figures at different points in the story for Pumpkin, to buffer to act as buffers against what she was experiencing from her biological mother and father. This idea of the the intergenerational trauma that is interlaced with race and class, informed by race and class, that all sort of converge on this little girl who has to become very aware of the moods and the temperaments of her parental figures, and then navigate around them. There are so many moments where Pumpkin is like listening to see if anybody's outside, and has to decide if she would go outside and meet them. And there's always this tension there when she is in the same space with her mother, because, and she used the analogy of trying to feed a cat, I think it was. trying to feed this cat and not sure if the cat would scratch you. And I felt those parts of the novel were well done, communicating this tension between and the fear and the anxiety that Pumpkin had held while dealing with her parental figures. Yeah. But
I
Having
think
heard
those
all of you, I'm
very
even
hard
more
to
impressed
recommend.
with this novel because I read it as a novel primarily concerned with class and color. And I thought the parent child relationships were secondary. A close second, but were secondary to those concerns. So it's really interesting that we all have very different perspectives. But this is a really well crafted novel, you know. As you know, those of you who know me well, I don't read YA. I have no interest in picnic book. But this one was really well done. I think even though it's a story of a child, it's the story that is a story that children, obviously written for children. I think even more so than Kipling Plus. In fact, until we spoke to Berkeley, I didn't realize that Berkeley conceived of Kipling Plus as a YA novel because I thought it was an adult novel. Um, but this one is very obviously written for children. Written for children. Like for example, Berkeley deal speaks of adolescent sexuality without any fear, without any covering it up. This one, it skirts around adolescent sexuality the way you expect an ordinary YA novel to do that. Um, you
No,
don't
I
think so?
disagree on that bit. No,
No,
I think
because like you said, Paula, you don't really read YA. And the thing about YA is it's the range is actually quite wide. It's from 13 to 18 is so in that range you can find I've read other YA books that did not skirt around sexuality at all. The
the whole
way
Twilight saga is about sexuality, right?
right. Yeah. I mean
All right.
the
Well,
yeah.
forgive my
So
ignorance. Like I said, no, I
but
don't read
I was
YA.
surprised I am surprised to hear that Kipling Class was conceived as a YA novel because I think that is definitely at the extreme end of the type of
Mm,
the way topics are presented in YA for sure. Um, yeah.
yeah. From a
I
male
was
perspective, I
surprised.
have to tell you that with this novel, I found it interesting coming from being sort of reflected through the lens of a young girl, right? Um, Coming into herself, coming of age, navigating through all these social complexities. Because flip it, and if she was writing about a male, similarly, I wonder what the what the tone would have been. And that takes me back to Kipling Plus, Paula. I saw Kipling Plus as Francine says it's on the other end of the spectrum of YA, but I saw it placed somewhere there on that spectrum, right? But with a lot of rougher edges, right? And the sort of things boys get up to, and it. Well, I mean that that I found interesting. Just listening to a young lady, learning about a young lady, a young female adolescent coming into her own. That, from a male perspective, was interesting too.
But I
Can I,
think a lot of it has to do with obviously the perspective of the author, right? Like where what is she trying to say and what is her perspective growing up as someone I believe who grew up middle class and what experiences she would have with the burgeoning sexuality of people that were not in her social class. Because
Mm,
remember, we spoke about this in Kipling Class too, Paula. We talked about the fact that in Kipling Class, they not only showed the sexuality of the boys, but also the sexuality of the girls. And you found that surprising because you hadn't really had any experience with girls being that way. So I think a lot of it has to do with, like where the author is from, and her own experiences growing up, and that colored how she presented that aspect. And I think also her story was really more focused on the how does someone growing up in this social class get out, in inverted commas, more so than all the other things that are happening when you're a teenager. She was really more focused on, okay, here's this young girl who wants to, do better, be better, or, and that was the focus of the novel. And so that's why I think the sexuality aspect of it was not definitely not the focus of this book at
I
all.
I disagree that it was totally not the focus though. I think it's not Pumpkin's experience, right? She's extremely inexperienced sexually, right? Extremely is probably not the right word because she's actually 14 in most of the book, and that's normally
Right.
inexperienced. So let me just retract that. She's not especially interested in boys. There's a one point where her friends are teasing her, "Have you got a boyfriend? Have you got a boyfriend?" And she's like, "What would I even do with a boyfriend?" And it's kind of a genuine question. And I think there's also another sign that she's very innocent sexually. When there's the interaction that she's away for 2 minutes and Mandy flees the house, right? Her father has said something in that 2 minutes. We know he's lascivious. He looks at her funny, right? So we as adults are reading this situation and having a sense of what's been said. We don't know, but we can guess. Whereas she's actually totally clueless. And I think she uses that, the
I
author.
don't know that she's clueless. I
She
think
is, 'cause
she thinks he did something inappropriate.
but I don't think it's. I didn't read it that way. I got the impression that she knows something bad has happened, but not that it's sexually inappropriate. Because the signs are that it's sexually inappropriate. Mandy's scared of him. She's trembling. Those are the signals that we get. I think as adult readers are that something inappropriate sexually has been said, and it scared Mandy so much she's leaving the house immediately. She's willing to play Ludo. She's going to get a drink of a soda or something, and now she's like, "I'm out of here now," right?
But Kessel,
But
Pumpkin was witnessing prior to that the when her mother and father disappeared into the bedroom, and she's in the house and they were carrying on
But
with the acts
even
and so
yeah,
on. I didn't
but
think
she
Pumpkin was
even
that
then
clueless.
she was, but she wasn't, she didn't still didn't exactly know what was going on, just
She
based
didn't
on the
know. I think
on the way that
okay.
she described it, especially initially.
Hmm.
She was unaware she may have figured it out, but I think initially she was just talking about weird noises,
Hmm. Hmm.
She
right?
knew it was sex. I think
I
Pumpkin knew
think
it
she
was
knew the
sex
sex.
but
I
what
think
I
she
was
knew
going
the
to
sex.
say
because
was,
she describes legs being up in the air. She
Yeah.
sees that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I think what I was going to say was that I think she juxtaposes that level of innocence sexually with her extreme adultification of being forced into adult because she has to parent herself. I think she's using it to kind of point out that like she's having a really different experience of adolescence than we think typically. You know, she's not out there having lots of fun because of the childhood that she's having. She's experiencing another way. That's all I was going to say.
And as Paula brought up Kipling Plass, when you juxtapose that with Kipling Plass, who I think was 15 in the novel, to remind me, 1 year difference, and his friends. I mean, all these guys were very exposed and having sex, you know. So I just found that juxtaposition
Yeah.
interesting. Yeah.
Yeah. This
I
is a
have a
very
question really quickly though, because I didn't go into this. I didn't go into the novel thinking that it was YA. And although I heard Paula say so, when I started reading it, I'm like, this is young adult, because I feel like there are texts that could be that have, adolescent subjects or characters, but aren't necessarily YA. Because I was like, look at all of what we're talking about, especially how she and the what Tony just mentioned there, with how her parents were, carrying on while she was in the room, no regard for any sort of protecting her innocence or anything. I'm like, I didn't get the sense that this text was young adult, but maybe I should treat it as a spectrum.
You're
Because
conservative, Deborah.
no, 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 no,
You think
no, no.
young adults.
No, I didn't think this was young adult.
Yeah,
Hmm.
I didn't read it
I
as a
didn't
YA
think
novel
so.
either. And I wonder if it's YA in the sense
Oh,
that like Rukaz Neg or Black Shack Ali is young adult. Like, these books that's a coming of age
I
story.
don't know. For me, it was fully and 100% YA. Like,
I think
and
Francine is the
like you said,
YA expert on
it's
the
a
panel.
spectrum, right? And
Mhm.
the way it was written. I mean, everything turned out so beautifully in the end. That's already, you know, but you knew that it was going to work out. Like, yes, there were stressful moments, there were, there was trauma, there was whatever, but it's still written in it, it has had more positivity was written into it compared to Kipling Plus, for example. It was the word I'm thinking of if I were to compare sweetness in the skin Freudian slip
Freudian
with
slip.
with Kipling Plus is that sweetness in the skin to me was sanitized. I mean, because we're talking about this is the 90s and we're talking about low income neighborhoods in Jamaica. If we compare it to, for example, what a mother's love don't teach you when when we were reading about the people living in poverty, we learned
A hungry
it was a
ghost.
lot,
But
right? So
didn't the novel answer that
the
itself
mere fact
though?
that a lot, yes, there were difficult, she addressed important topics, she addressed difficult topics, but it was sanitized, and for me that's what makes it a YA novel.
I
I
Okay,
have to
would you
stop everyone because we've run out of time. I know this is a novel that we could talk about a lot longer because I have a lot more that thoughts about this novel. I'm very impressed with this novel because all right, we're not agreed that it's a YA novel. We're not all of the same mind, but the subject is a child, and it's not the kind of novel I would normally read, but I was enraptured by this novel. The next time you see us, we will be having a conversation with Ishi Robinson. So perhaps we'll be able to talk about some of the more complex aspects of this novel. Thank you for joining us.